Imagine being the smartest person who ever lived. The man who discovered gravity, who invented calculus, who decoded the physics of light. The man who, looking at the universe itself, understood it. In 1720, that man invested his life savings into a company that had almost no real business. He knew it was risky. He got out early. He made a profit. And then he watched everyone around him get richer without him. So he went back in, at the peak, and lost almost everything. If Isaac Newton could not see this trap coming, what chance did anyone else have? This is the story of the South Sea Bubble, history's greatest financial con, the scandal that corrupted a king, destroyed a parliament, and ruined tens of thousands of ordinary British citizens in the space of a single summer. And the story of the one man, an unlikely hero, a stubborn farmer's son from Norfolk, who stepped into the wreckage and saved Britain from total collapse. This is a story about greed, about power, about the moment a government decided its own people were a resource to be mined, and about what happens when the mine runs dry. Stay with me, because unlike Tulip Mania, where the madness was driven by ordinary people caught in something they didn't understand, this time the madness was engineered by the most powerful men in Britain, on purpose. The year is 1710. Britain is exhausted. For nearly a decade, the country had been fighting the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal, expensive conflict against France that had dragged on across 3 continents, through the fields of Belgium, the mountains of Spain, and the harbors of the Caribbean. The war was not going badly, but it was costing a fortune, and the bills had piled up like a mountain no government could climb. By 1710, Britain's national debt stood at approximately £9 million. In an era when a skilled craftsman earned perhaps £30 a year, £9 million was an almost comprehensible sum. The government was paying enormous interest on that debt every year. The money was going out. Not enough was coming in. And there was no obvious solution. No way to raise enough in taxes without triggering revolt. No way to borrow more without making the problem worse. Britain was the most powerful nation in the world, and it was quietly, systematically running out of money. Into this crisis walked a man with an idea. Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford, was one of the most cunning political operators in British history. He had survived decades of the most brutal political environment in the world, the court of Queen Anne, where fortunes were made and destroyed in a single conversation, where today's minister was tomorrow's prisoner in the Tower of London. Harley had not survived by being straightforward. He had survived by being creative. And in 1710, staring at the national debt, he had his most creative idea yet. What if the debt didn't have to be paid? What if instead of paying it, it could be converted? The idea was elegant in the way that all dangerous ideas are elegant. What if the government created a new company, a joint stock corporation, that would absorb Britain's national debt? The people to whom the government owed money, the holders of government bonds, would be offered shares in this new company instead. They would stop being government creditors. They would become shareholders. The debt would not disappear, but it would become someone else's problem. In exchange for taking on this mountain of debt, the new company would receive something extraordinary from the government. A gift. A monopoly on all British trade with South America and the Pacific Islands. The South Sea Company was born in 1711. And on paper, just on paper, the opportunity was staggering. South America in 1711 was the most resource-rich territory on Earth. The Spanish colonies were overflowing with silver from the mines of Potosi mines, so productive they had single-handedly financed the Spanish Empire for a century. There was gold, sugar, spices, timber, dyes. A trade monopoly with that world could theoretically generate unlimited wealth. Unlimited. The word itself was intoxicating. A company that controlled British trade with South America would be, by definition, the most valuable corporation in the history of commerce. Its shares would be worth a fortune. The holders of the government's debt were told this. They were told they were being offered something extraordinary: the chance to trade in their dull government bonds for shares in the future of British commerce. Many of them accepted. The debt was converted. The South Sea Company was capitalized. And Robert Harley, clever, careful, calculating Robert Harley, sat back and waited for the profits to flow. They did not flow. Because there was a problem so fundamental it should have killed the entire scheme before it began. Britain had no trading rights with Spanish South America. None. Spain controlled those colonies. Spain was not going to open its ports to British ships. The Spanish Empire had spent 200 years building those trade routes, and it had absolutely no intention of sharing them. The War of the Spanish Succession had just ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. That treaty did grant Britain something: the right to supply enslaved people to Spanish colonies, the so-called asiento, and the right to send one ship per year to trade general goods. One ship per year. That was the entirety of Britain's South American trade monopoly. Not a fleet, not open ports, not free access to the silver mines of Potosi. One ship, one voyage, once a year. And even that single ship was subject to Spanish inspections, taxes, and the constant risk of having its cargo seized on any pretext. The South Sea Company's directors knew this. The government knew this. The lawyers who drafted the charter knew this. But the investors, the tens of thousands of ordinary British citizens who would eventually pour their savings into this company, did not know this. And no one was in any hurry to tell them. Because the story of one ship per year did not sell shares. The story of unlimited South American riches of silver and gold flowing into British coffers in an endless tide that sold shares. So that was the story they told. And it worked. For the first several years of its existence, the South Sea Company was essentially a government debt management vehicle dressed in the costume of a trading empire. It sent its one ship per year to South America. It made modest, unremarkable profits from the slave trade. Its share price bumped along at modest levels. The men running the company knew the truth of what they had created. They knew the trade routes were a fantasy, but they also knew something else. They knew that the company's real value, its only real value, was its relationship with the government. As long as the government needed the company to manage its debt, as long as the political arrangement held the company existed. And as long as the company existed, opportunities could be created. They were patient men. They were waiting for their moment. In 1719, it arrived. Across the English Channel, France was in the grip of a financial fever. John Law, a Scottish financier of extraordinary brilliance and even more extraordinary recklessness, had created the Mississippi Company. The Mississippi Company controlled French trade with North America, with Louisiana, with Canada, with the vast and largely unexplored interior of the continent. And Law had done something remarkable with it. He had convinced France that this company and the new paper currency he had created to finance it represented unlimited future wealth. The French had believed him. By 1719, Mississippi Company shares had risen by more than 1,800%. Paris was drunk on paper wealth. The Rue Quincampoix The narrow street where Mississippi Company shares were traded was so crowded that coaches could not pass. Stories circulated of servants who had become richer than their masters, of cobblers and cooks who had retired as millionaires, of a hunchback who reportedly made a small fortune simply by renting his back as a writing surface for investors who needed to sign contracts in the street. London watched from across the Channel, and London was envious. The South Sea Company's directors watched the Mississippi bubble with the cold calculation of men who recognized an opportunity. If France could do it, Britain could do it better. All they needed was the right moment to make their move. In 1720, the South Sea Company's directors made a proposal to the British government. It was breathtaking in its ambition. The company they proposed would take over the entire British national debt. Not part of it, not some of it, all of it. Every government bond, every creditor, every outstanding obligation, all of it would be converted into South Sea Company shares. The national debt, which had grown to approximately £30 million by 1720, would effectively disappear from the government's books. The government would be free. In exchange, the company wanted two things. First, a cash payment from the government to be funded by new share sales. This would give the company a capital base. Second, and this was the critical element, the company wanted the right to issue new shares to the public, as many as it wanted, at whatever price the market would bear. This second demand was the engine of the entire scheme. Because if the company could issue unlimited shares at whatever price the market would pay, and if the directors could drive that price high enough, then the difference between what they paid for the debt and what they raised from share sales would be enormous. That difference would go to the directors. It was not a trading scheme. It was not an investment vehicle. It was a mechanism for making a small number of people extraordinarily rich at the expense of everyone who bought the shares. The government accepted the proposal. Because the government, or at least enough of the right people in the government, had already been taken care of. What followed Parliament's approval was not investment. It was not commerce. It was a carefully engineered pump-and-dump scheme on a national scale run by some of the most powerful men in Britain. And it began with bribery. Systematic, calculated, almost industrial bribery. The South Sea Company's directors, led above all by John Blunt, a self-made businessman of formidable energy and absolutely no moral scruple, began quietly distributing shares to the most important people in Britain. Members of Parliament received shares at below-market prices, shares they could sell immediately for a guaranteed profit, on the condition that they supported the scheme in the House of Commons. Government ministers received similar arrangements. A senior Treasury official received shares. The Secretary of State received shares. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man responsible for overseeing Britain's national finances, received shares. King George I himself was made honorary governor of the company and quietly given a share allocation worth tens of thousands of pounds. The king's two mistresses famously nicknamed the Elephant and the Maypole by the British press. Reflecting their dramatically different physical appearances, each received enormous share allocations as personal gifts from the company. The corruption went all the way to the top. And it worked. Parliament passed the South Sea Act in April 1720. Every man who voted for it had been paid. The machine was loaded. The trigger was pulled. It is worth pausing here to understand what had just happened. The British Parliament, the institution that existed specifically to represent the British people against the arbitrary power of monarchs and corporations, had just voted to hand a private corporation control of the national debt in exchange for bribes. The men who received those shares did not declare them. They did not recuse themselves from the vote. They voted yes, pocketed their share certificates, and told the public they were acting in the national interest. Robert Walpole, a stocky, plain-spoken member of Parliament from Norfolk, who would later become Britain's first Prime Minister, was one of the very few voices in Parliament who opposed the scheme. He stood in the House of Commons and warned that the South Sea proposal was built on foundations that could not support the weight being placed on them. He was ignored. Not argued with. Ignored. The men around him were too busy counting their share certificates to listen. And so the act passed, and the doors opened. The moment Parliament approved the scheme, the South Sea Company began its first share subscription. The doors of the company's offices on Threadneedle Street were opened to investors. The response was beyond anything anyone had anticipated. Within hours of the subscription opening, the queue stretched around the block. Within days, thousands of investors of every social rank were fighting to buy shares. Aristocrats sent footmen to hold their places in the queue. Merchants arrived at dawn. Clergymen, men of God responsible for the financial welfare of their congregations, joined the line. Women in fine dresses stood beside dock workers in leather aprons. Army officers and shopkeepers and lawyers and servants all pressed together, all clutching their money, all certain they were about to become rich. The share price, which had stood at around £128 at early 1,720, began to rise. And then it began to race. By March, £330. By May, £550. By June, £890. By late July, over £1,000 per share. A nearly 700% increase in 7 months. The streets around Exchange Alley in London, the narrow lanes where brokers and investors gathered to trade, became so crowded that people could barely move. Coffee houses were turned into impromptu trading floors. Deals were made in doorways, in coaches, in the middle of the street. Ladies of fashion speculated alongside dock workers. Clergymen pledged church funds. Military officers gambled their pensions. A contemporary observer wrote that he had never seen anything like it, that the entire city of London seemed to have decided, simultaneously and collectively, that the normal rules of commerce and caution no longer applied. The fever spread beyond the South Sea Company itself. Dozens of other companies, seeing the madness and wanting a share of it, rushed to form and list on the London market. These became known as the bubble companies. Corporations formed with the sole purpose of capitalizing on investment mania, many with no genuine business purpose whatsoever. One offered shares in a company for importing jackasses from Spain. Another promised to improve the art of making soap. Another proposed to trade in hair. And then there was the most extraordinary one of all. One prospectus, one actual legal investment document distributed to the British public in the summer of 1,720 offered shares in what it described as a company for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. That was the entire description. No business plan, no assets, no stated purpose. Just a promise that the advantage would be great, and a request for your money. The promoter opened his subscription office at 9 o'clock in the morning. By noon, 3 hours later, he had collected £2,000 in deposits from eager investors. By afternoon, he had left London. He took the money with him. No one ever knew his name. No one ever saw him again. This story was not considered, at the time, particularly remarkable. Because in the summer of 1,720 inches London, it was simply one more story of one more man making money in one more inexplicable way. The city had lost the ability to distinguish between the plausible and the absurd. Everything was an opportunity. Everything was going up. Until it wasn't. Sir Isaac Newton was 77 years old in 1720. He was, by any measure, the greatest intellect Britain had ever produced, and perhaps the greatest the world had ever seen. He had formulated the laws of gravity and planetary motion. He had invented calculus independently of Leibniz. He had demonstrated that white light was composed of the full spectrum of colors. He had, almost single-handedly, created the mathematical and physical framework within which the modern world still operates. He was also the master of the Royal Mint, Britain's most senior financial official. Newton had invested in the South Sea Company early in the initial stages, when the price was rising steadily and the scheme was not yet at full madness. He was not a fool. He watched the price rise. He analyzed the numbers. And at some point in spring 1720, he made a decision. He sold. He took his profit, a substantial profit, and he walked away. And he reportedly told a friend something that should have been written on the wall of every investment house in London. I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. He was right. He knew it was a bubble. He got out. And for a few weeks, he was the wisest man in England. Then the price kept going up. Without him, and Newton, who had just demonstrated the intellectual clarity to recognize a bubble and escape it, found himself in the worst position a rational person can occupy. He was watching people he considered his intellectual inferiors become wealthy beyond imagination by doing something he had correctly identified as irrational. His colleagues at the Royal Mint were counting their profits. His friends in the scientific community were talking about nothing else. Men who had never understood a mathematical equation in their lives were wealthier on paper than Newton had been in all his years of public service. And the price kept rising. £600, £700, £800. Newton had sold at what felt like a peak. But the market had kept climbing without him. And in the human mind, in even the greatest human mind, there is a point at which rational analysis is overwhelmed by something more powerful. Not greed, exactly. Something more subtle. The unbearable feeling of being proven wrong by people who should not be right. In the summer of 1720, Isaac Newton, the greatest mathematician who ever lived, bought back into the South Sea Company. Near the very top of the market, he invested approximately £22,000. In today's money, several million pounds. At almost the worst possible moment. He never spoke publicly about what followed. But the numbers tell the story that the words could not. When the South Sea bubble collapsed, Newton lost approximately £20,000. 20,000. The equivalent of nearly his entire life savings. Gone. In his private papers, the South Sea Company is mentioned only once in a single line of careful accounting, the numbers precise and the prose absent. The man who explained the universe had no words for what the market had done to him. Because the market had not been irrational. It had been human. And even Newton, it turned out, was only human.
By August 1720, something was shifting beneath the gleaming surface of the South Sea mania. The change was barely perceptible at first. A slight pause in the upward movement of the price. A small dip that was immediately explained away by the company's brokers as temporary a moment to buy before the next surge. But behind the scenes, the mathematics were catching up with the scheme. The South Sea Company had a problem it had created itself. In order to keep the share price rising, in order to maintain the illusion of value that justified the extraordinary valuations, the company needed a continuous flow of new buyers. Every bubble needs new money coming in. The price rises because buyers outnumber sellers. The moment that changes the moment sellers outnumber buyers, the price falls. And the company had made the problem worse by lending money to investors to buy its own shares. Think about what that means. The company was essentially borrowing against its own share price to create demand for its own shares, a circular scheme that worked perfectly as long as the price kept rising, and became catastrophically self-destructive the moment it stopped. It was not a trading company. It was not an investment vehicle. It was a financial perpetual motion machine, beautiful to look at, mathematically impossible, and about to break down. In June 1720, Parliament had passed something called the Bubble Act. Ironically, the South Sea Company itself had lobbied for this legislation. It wanted to eliminate competition from the other bubble companies that were drawing investment away from South Sea shares. The act made it illegal to operate a joint stock company without a royal charter. Within weeks, dozens of bubble companies were shut down. Their investors rushed to sell whatever they had. The money that had been circulating freely through the London market suddenly contracted, and the South Sea Company, though it had engineered the Bubble Act for its own protection, found itself caught in the panic it had accidentally unleashed. In late August 1720, a rumor began circulating in Exchange Alley. It was quiet at first, barely a whisper, but the content of the whisper was enough to change everything. The directors of the South Sea Company were selling their own shares. On September the 1st, 1720, the South Sea Company share price stood at £775. 11 days later, September the 12th, it was £520, a drop of 33% in less than 2 weeks. The whisper in Exchange Alley became a shout, then a roar, then a stampede. By October the 1st, the price had fallen to £290. By December, £124, an 87% collapse. In 3 months, the speed was even more savage than tulip mania. When the Dutch tulip market collapsed in February 1637, the crash had still taken weeks to reach its full devastation. Buyers had time to try to sell. Some had managed to exit before the very bottom. In London in 1720, people had days, sometimes hours. The investors who tried to sell on September the 1st found buyers at $775. The investors who tried to sell on September the 12th found buyers, if they found buyers at all, at $520. The investors who waited, who believed the brokers who said this was temporary, who told themselves the company would recover, found themselves holding certificates worth £124, for which they had paid over $1,000. And the people who had borrowed money to buy those certificates, the people who had pledged their homes, their businesses, their estates as collateral for loans to fund their investments, were in a different situation entirely. They were ruined. As the panic spread through London, the Bank of England attempted an intervention. The bank proposed an emergency merger with the South Sea Company, a rescue plan designed to absorb the company's liabilities, stabilize the share price, and prevent the collapse from spreading to the broader British economy. The announcement was made public in September 1720. It made things worse. The market's reaction to the bank's intervention was not reassurance. It was terror. If the Bank of England itself felt the need to intervene, if the anchor of British financial stability was alarmed enough to propose an emergency merger, then the crisis was even worse than anyone had admitted. The announcement triggered a new wave of selling. Within days, the merger plan collapsed. The bank retreated, and the South Sea Company's share price continued its vertical descent. By October 1720, it was clear that no intervention, financial, political, or otherwise, was going to stop the collapse. The bubble had burst. The only question now was the damage. The damage was enormous. Thousands of investors who had borrowed money to buy shares were wiped out completely. Not just their South Sea profits, those were gone. Not just their original investment that was gone. Everything they had pledged as collateral, their homes, their shops, their farms, their furniture, gone. Aristocrats who had pledged their country estates lost them. Military officers who had staked their pension entitlements lost them. Clergymen who had invested church funds entrusted to them by their congregations, found themselves facing the most profound professional disgrace. Widows who had put their entire inheritance into South Sea shares found themselves destitute. One member of Parliament, writing in his private diary, as the scale of the collapse became clear, described the feeling in one sentence: "Our South Sea dream is over. We are all undone." And Isaac Newton. Newton had lost 20,000 pounds. He returned to his work at the Royal Mint. He returned to his mathematics. He returned to his prisms and his telescopes and the vast, orderly, comprehensible universe he had spent his life studying. The universe obeyed his equations. The market had not. He never spoke of the South Sea Company again in public. In his private notebooks, the loss is recorded in one line. The handwriting, normally so precise and controlled, is slightly uneven on that page, as if the hand that wrote it was not entirely steady.
By October 1720, Parliament had been recalled for an emergency session. A committee of investigation was established. And what that committee found over the following months of hearings, document seizures, and witness examinations was almost beyond belief. Not because the corruption was hidden, but because of how brazen it had been. The bribery of members of Parliament, the share allocations to the king's mistresses, the secret arrangements with government ministers, the fraudulent accounting that had disguised the true state of the company's affairs from investors, the deliberate manipulation of the share price through artificial transactions designed to create the illusion of demand, and most damning of all, the evidence that virtually everyone at the senior levels of British government had known about, participated in, or personally profited from the scheme. The South Sea Company had not been a trading company. It had never been a trading company. It had been a machine for transferring public money into private hands with the full knowledge and active participation of the British government at its highest levels. The parliamentary investigators made their findings public. The public response was fury. Not the quiet, embarrassed fury of a people who feel they should have known better. The hot, righteous fury of a people who had been deliberately, systematically deceived by the men they had trusted with the nation. The streets outside Westminster were not quiet. The reckoning came swiftly. Several directors of the South Sea Company were arrested. Their estates were confiscated, not partially, but entirely. Parliament passed special legislation allowing the government to seize the directors' assets and use them to partially compensate the investors who had been ruined. John Blunt, the architect of the entire scheme, the man who had designed the bribery network, who had lobbied Parliament, who had issued the shares at inflated prices, knowing they would collapse, was stripped of all but 10,000 pounds of a fortune, estimated at over 200,000. He considered himself badly treated. The Postmaster General, one of the most senior officials in the British government, was found to have received South Sea shares as a bribe. He was expelled from Parliament and imprisoned in the Tower of London. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man personally responsible for Britain's financial integrity, was found guilty of corruption and stripped of his office in disgrace. Several members of the investigation committee received death threats. One South Sea director, facing financial ruin and public humiliation, obtained a pistol and shot himself in the head while in his parliamentary quarters. He survived. He survived and was brought before Parliament with a bandaged wound still clearly visible above his ear. He sat in the chamber while MPs debated his punishment. He said very little. There was, perhaps, very little left to say. The scene was extraordinary, even by the standards of an extraordinary scandal. A man who had helped design the greatest financial fraud in British history, sitting in the Parliament he had helped corrupt, with a self-inflicted gunshot wound visible above his eye, listening to the consequences being read aloud. If you had tried to invent a more perfect image of the moment greed destroys itself, you couldn't. Through all of this, through the arrests, the confiscations, the suicides, the parliamentary fury, one man had been working quietly in the background. Robert Walpole, the same stocky, plain-spoken Norfolk man who had stood alone in the House of Commons and warned that the scheme would end in catastrophe, who had been ignored, who had watched it collapse exactly as he predicted, and who, unlike virtually everyone else in a position of power, had clean hands. Walpole had not taken South Sea shares. He had not voted for the South Sea Act. He had not profited from the corruption. In a parliament where almost every senior figure was tainted, where finding a minister who had not received a bribe was nearly impossible, Walpole was that rarest of things. A man who had been right, and a man who was honest. Britain in late 1720 was not just in financial crisis. It was an institutional crisis. The Parliament had been corrupted. The government had been corrupted. The king had personally profited from a scheme that had ruined his subjects. The Bank of England had failed to prevent the collapse. The entire framework of British financial governance had been revealed as hollow. Someone needed to rebuild it. Someone with the authority that comes from having been right, and the competence to actually do the work. Walpole was that person. In 1721, Robert Walpole became First Lord of the Treasury, in effect, the head of government. He held the position for the next 21 years, the longest continuous tenure in the history of British government. What he built during those 21 years, the institutional architecture he created to prevent another South Sea catastrophe, became the framework of modern British governance. Executive accountability to Parliament. The principle that the head of government was answerable not to the king alone, but to the elected representatives of the people. The separation, however imperfect, between the interests of the state and the interests of private corporations. A financial regulatory culture, cautious, skeptical, deliberate, that would define the Bank of England and British monetary policy for the next 2 centuries. Walpole became known, and this title was originally meant as an insult by his opponents, as the Prime Minister. The first Prime Minister. The office that today governs Britain, the office that Winston Churchill would hold in the Second World War, that Margaret Thatcher would hold in the 1980s, that exists today at 10 Downing Street, was created, in its essential form, in direct response to the South Sea bubble. The greatest financial scandal in British history created the instrument of modern British government. The con gave birth to the accountability that the con had proved was necessary. History, as always, has a complicated sense of justice. The South Sea bubble left 3 permanent marks on British history. The first was the Bubble Act itself. Though passed to protect the South Sea Company from competition, the Act remained law for over a century. It severely restricted the formation of new joint stock companies in Britain, making it extremely difficult for entrepreneurs and inventors to raise the capital needed to fund new businesses. Historians have argued that this overcorrection significantly slowed British corporate development in the decades following the crash. The very law that was supposed to prevent another bubble may have also delayed the organizational structures that would have powered the Industrial Revolution more quickly. The second legacy was Robert Walpole's political architecture. The office of Prime Minister. The principle of ministerial responsibility. The foundation of what would become, over the following centuries, parliamentary democracy as Britain and much of the world understands it today. The third legacy, the most intimate and perhaps the most enduring, was Isaac Newton's loss. £20,000. It passed into legend almost immediately. Not because Newton was uniquely foolish, but because Newton was uniquely intelligent. And if the most intelligent man alive could not resist the South Sea mania, if the mind that had decoded the laws of the universe could be undone by the madness of a London street market, then what did that say about the human capacity to reason in the face of collective delusion? The question has never been adequately answered. Here is what haunts me about the South Sea Bubble. In 1637, 83 years before the South Sea Bubble destroyed the fortunes of tens of thousands of British citizens, the Dutch Republic experienced almost exactly the same event. Ordinary people, paper contracts, an asset with no fundamental value to justify its price, a market driven by the belief that prices would only ever go up. The crash, the ruin, the legal chaos. Tulip mania was not unknown to the British. Charles Mackay, who would later write the most famous account of both events, described how the South Sea Bubble promoters were aware of the Dutch story. The educated men of 1,720 London, the merchants, the lawyers, the MPs, the ministers had access to accounts of what had happened in Holland in 1637. They knew the shape of what a speculative bubble looked like. They knew how it ended. And then they built one anyway. In 1721, as the investigations wound down and the worst of the panic subsided, a satirical print circulated through the coffee houses and drawing rooms of London. It showed the South Sea Company as a great merry-go-round, ordinary British citizens riding in circles at increasing speed, their money flying outward as they spun. Company directors standing at the center, collecting it all. The caption read, "The Bubblers' Medley, a scene of sadness." And at the very bottom of the print in the corner, barely visible, easy to miss entirely, a tulip. Just one. In a glass vase. Someone remembered. It hadn't helped. Why? Why does this keep happening? Tulip mania in 1637. The South Sea Bubble in 1720. The Mississippi Bubble in 1719. The South Sea Bubble's echoes in the railway mania of the year 1840s. The Wall Street crash of 1929. The dot-com bubble of 2000. The housing market in 2008. The cryptocurrency markets of 2017 and 2021. The same shape, every time. Rising prices, crowds flooding in, the peak, the whisper, the crash, the ruin. Why can't we learn? Newton's loss is the best answer we have. Because Newton did learn, and then forgot. He sold. He was right. He got out. And then he watched the price keep rising without him. And the thing that brought him back in was not stupidity. It was not ignorance. It was something far more human and far more dangerous. It was the unbearable experience of watching other people be rewarded for something you know is wrong. It was the social proof of an entire city telling you that this time is different. It was the creeping doubt that perhaps, just perhaps, you were the one who had made a mistake. We are not wired to hold a correct, unpopular opinion indefinitely in the face of overwhelming social pressure that says we are wrong. Even Isaac Newton is not wired that way. Even the greatest mind in human history could not sustain rational conviction against the full weight of collective delusion. The greed is always greater than the memory. Every generation learns the lesson from books, and then lives through it in reality, and decides as every generation has always decided that this time is different, that the rules that applied before do not apply now, that they are not the fool. They are the early adopter. They are the exception. They are not the exception. The South Sea Company did not die in 1720. Like many things that should have ended, it limped on. Its debts were restructured. Its directors were punished, some of them, Its functions were absorbed into the broader machinery of British finance. The company continued to exist in name for another 130 years. Its last act, in 1850, was to sell its remaining assets and formally dissolve. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of what it had once been, just a clerk locking a door and pocketing a key. 130 years after the greatest financial scandal in British history, the institution at the center of it ended with a locked door and a forgotten key. Nobody noticed. Robert Walpole governed Britain for 21 years and died in 1745, the longest-serving head of government in British history. Isaac Newton lived until 1727. He continued his work at the Royal Mint until his final years. He never invested in speculative markets again. In 1721, the year after his loss, he published the fourth edition of his Principia Mathematica, the laws of the universe precisely described, the mathematics of everything except the one thing that had defeated him, the mathematics of people. Every empire carries within it the seeds of its own collapse. Not always through war, not always through plague or invasion or the slow weight of years. Sometimes through nothing more complex than this: a small group of powerful people who decide that the rules do not apply to them, who dress a lie in the costume of opportunity, who tell a story so beautiful that an entire nation believes it, and who collect the money while the story lasts. The South Sea bubble lasted 7 months at its peak. 7 months of extraordinary prices. 7 months of ordinary people convinced they had finally found the secret to wealth. 7 months before the locked door. If this story changed how you see the world, and these stories always should hit subscribe on Collapsed Empire. Because we are not done. Not even close. The empires keep rising. And they keep falling. And every single one of them thought they were the exception. See you in the ruins.
Next, on Collapsed Empire. 140 years after the South Sea bubble. A new empire at the height of its power. A new technology promising to transform the world. A new wave of ordinary people pouring their savings into certificates they don't fully understand. The railway mania of 1840s Britain. Same greed. Different rails. Same ending. That story is waiting for you, right there on your screen. See you in the ruins.